In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at creating video annotation projects using Alegion Control. Now, if you've just created your account and you log in, you're going to be taken to the Projects tab. This is probably the best place to start if you want to come in and create a new project or edit an existing project. If you're using Control for the first time, you might want to start on the Assets tab. Assets are basically the raw, unlabeled data that you'll add to your annotation projects. So let's start here, and we're going to add an asset. It's basically going to be the basketball clip that we use for the annotation tutorial. And then we'll go ahead and create a project around annotating that basketball use case. One of the great things about assets also is that they can be used across projects. So once you add an asset, you can annotate it in multiple projects for a variety of use cases. So we'll click here. This opens up the Add Asset dialog. Now you can add assets either using URLs that are in a CSV file, or you can upload local files. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and just use a local file. So let me pick my basketball movie. We'll click there. It's going to go ahead and start uploading. You'll see the upload status here. You'll also see a frames per second estimate over here in this column. So one of the things about video assets is we need to know the exact frames per second for the file. The file must have a constant frame rate, and it must be entered accurately. So one of the great things about Alegion Control is it doesn't require any pre-processing of your video files. You don't need to do that. You don't need to wait for our system to pre-process the files. We just need the accurate frames per second. So we estimate that in the background. If what you enter matches our estimate, you're all clear. We also encourage you to use our video validator. So again, you can just annotate video files with no pre-processing, but we need to make sure that those files are healthy and free of any errors and have a constant frame rate. Make sure there's no missing frames or encoding errors. This tool, which we cover in another tutorial, will do all of that for you. So it just gives you a pretty thorough evaluation and report on your video files. So I'll go ahead and click Finalize. And there we have that asset. Now we can go ahead and create a project, add this file, and have it ready for our annotators. So I'm going to go ahead and click here. I'm going to create another project. So let me go ahead and change the default name. I'll just call this B-ball because I have another project named basketball. And I'll save that project. And now we're ready to start adding records to it. So I'll go ahead and create a new record. So a record is basically a combination of the asset and the annotations that are applied to it. So as I mentioned earlier, you can use assets across projects. So I'm going to add a record to this project. I'm going to pick that basketball video. We're going to go ahead and add that. And you'll see the status of this record is it's not quite ready to annotate. The status says needs ontology. So the ontology is basically the configuration that basically specifies how the video can be annotated in Control. So we'll go ahead and create an ontology around that basketball use case, and then we'll preview it and we'll be ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on the ontology section. And one of the things I'll do first is add some annotation instructions. And I'm going to do that also through a local file. So this is just a markdown file, just markdown language, simple way to format your instructions with text formatting and images. You'll see this in the annotation preview when we get there. So I'll go ahead and add that set of instructions and upload it. And now we're going to go ahead and add our entities and classifications and relationships. So in this particular use case with the basketball video, what I want to do is be able to have localization for players with a bounding box and a classification of what activity they're performing. But I also want to localize, in this case, the basketball with a key point. And I want to know which player has possession of that ball. So we're going to set up what we call as an association, which is really like a relationship between the ball and the player. Then we'll preview it and we'll be ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and add an entity type. And in this case, I'll just say player. And I'll go ahead and enter that. It's going to be localized with a bounding box. So we'll just leave that selection. And we're going to add a classification. So a classification is basically a property of the entity. In this case, it's going to be a property that indicates what action that player is performing. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new classification. I'm going to call this classification action and give it a description. Now the classification is going to be a single selection. It could be a multiple selection or a text entry. We preview it here. I'm going to rename the first default value, and I'm going to rename that to passing. I'm also going to add dribbling. And I'm going to add a third value for shooting. There we go. We have our three values. I'm not going to specify a default value, and I'm going to let the annotators also choose nothing if the player isn't performing any of those actions. So I'll go ahead and click done. And having done that, I've got my classification for action, and I can edit or delete that. We also have a built-in classification for visibility. So if an entity, in this case a player, goes out of frame, we can mark that player as out of frame, and then when that entity returns, that player returns, we can mark that player in frame. So that's just a way to have and track when entities are out of frame and ensure entity persistence across the video. So we'll go ahead and click done, and we'll add our second entity type, which is going to be ball. So, and if I wanted to, I can give that a description. In this case, just for variety, we're going to make it a key point. And I'm not going to add a classification to basketball. I've got that one classification for player. I'm just going to, of course, we'll have this same visibility classification for ball as we did for player. And we'll click done. And then the last thing I want to do is add an association. So one of the things I want to be able to do in this use case is track which player has possession of the ball. So I'm going to add an association, and I'm going to call this association has ball. And then all I need to do is select the relationship or the items or the entities that are in this relationship. So the source is the player and the target entity is the ball. I'll click done. That sets up a relationship between the player and the ball. So having done that, I've basically set up my ontology for this use case. I'm basically done. I can come in and edit this ontology, change it, add to it, etc. I'm going to go ahead and click here to preview. So this will just give you a preview of your ontology in the video annotation tool. And what we'll do is we just load up the first record, the first video record in your project. So I'll go ahead and click preview. Here we go. And you can see that I've got my video loaded up. I've got my annotation instructions I've got an image of how it's supposed to be localized. And I can come in And in this case, I can just play around with it to make sure it's correct. So it just looks and feels and behaves exactly as the annotation tool would. I can come in, add an entity for the ball, entity for the player, have all the functionality of the video annotation tool. Basically check it out. I can see that my classifications and my associations are exactly what I expect. So I can just close it at this point. One of the things we also do that can be handy to kind of validate your ontology is we have a button to download the JSON output from the tool. So you could perform some annotations in here, click download, and get the JSON output right away. And that JSON output will just give you a concrete sense of what you're going to get from your annotation projects. So I'll go ahead and click to close. And now that I've done that, we've got some records. We've got an ontology. We'll go back and click on the record section. That record is now available to be annotated. So it's basically ready to go. So an annotator can come in and click here and then begin annotating that video. And the annotation process we cover in another one of our tutorials. Once the annotations are complete, or rather an annotator's completed annotating a video, you can come over to the annotation section, view which records have been completed, and also generate export packages for those annotations as well. So that gives you a quick overview of how to add assets and set up your first project.